Imagine Christmas, a time for family, warmth, and belonging. Now, imagine being forgotten every single Christmas, year after year, until you finally snap. I swore this year would be different. I bought an old manor, a fortress, for peace. But then, on Christmas Eve, my parents showed up with a locksmith and a fake lease, ready to steal it all. They had no idea I'd already filled that dark, quiet house with police and reporters, all waiting for them to break down the door. 4 years, being forgotten on December 25th was my family's most cherished tradition. It happened so often that I eventually stopped trying to remind them I existed. This Christmas, I decided to give myself a different kind of gift, absolute, undeniable peace. So, I bought an old manor, a sprawling, silent place where I could finally, truly disappear. The morning after I arrived, 2 sleek black SUVs pulled up my private drive. A locksmith stood ready to crack the gate. They thought I bought this house to live in it. They were wrong. I bought this entire estate to finally, definitively, end their twisted game of forgetting me. My name is Claire Lopez, and at 35, I had become a living statistician of my own quiet agony. I calculated the probability of parental affection with the same cold, detached precision I applied to my job at high risk and compliance. In my world, we dealt in liability. We told massive corporations which corners they could cut without bringing the whole structure crashing down, and which tiny cracks in the foundation would inevitably lead to absolute disaster. It was a job that demanded a certain numbness, an ability to look at a looming catastrophe and see only paperwork. This wasn't just a job skill. It was a survival skill I'd been unknowingly perfecting since I was 7 years old. That was the first Christmas my parents, Graham and Marilyn, forgot to set a place for me at the dinner table. They called it an accident. My frantic mother, my distracted father, and my golden child younger brother, Derek, who devoured every ounce of attention in the room. I remember sitting on the stairs, clutching a plastic reindeer, watching them feast, laughing without me. When they finally noticed, an hour later, their excuse was flimsy. "Oh, Claire, we thought you were napping. You're always so quiet. We just lost track." I was 7, so I accepted it. What else could I do? Their approval was my only currency. But the accidents didn't stop. They became a tradition, as reliable as the tree or the stockings. They forgot me when they booked plane tickets for a family vacation to Aspen when I was 16. They forgot me when they planned a graduation dinner for Derek, but somehow missed my own ceremony 2 years prior. It wasn't a lapse in memory. It was a weapon, a silent, devastating way of communicating my exact standing in the Caldwell family hierarchy without ever uttering a single word. Of course, they remembered me perfectly when they needed something. When Derek crashed his car and needed bail money. When Graham needed my signature on a loan document because his credit was leveraged to the hilt. Oh, then, I was indispensable. It was only when it came time to give love, or space, or even just a simple meal, that my existence conveniently blurred. Last year was the breaking point. The numbness I'd cultivated finally hardened into something sharp, something useful. It was December 24th, and I'd driven 4 hours through a blinding sleet storm to reach their house in Connecticut. I hadn't been explicitly invited, but I hadn't been uninvited either. There was a gray area where we always lived. I foolishly assumed family was the default setting. My sedan crunched into the driveway, my trunk filled with gifts I'd spent 2 months' salary on. The house windows glowed with that warm, amber light, the kind you see on greeting cards. I could hear music, see silhouettes moving inside. I walked to the front door, my coat heavy with freezing rain, and looked through the side pane. They were all there. Graham was holding court by the fireplace, a scotch in his hand. Marilyn was laughing, her head thrown back, wearing the diamond earrings I'd bought her the year before. Derek, his newest girlfriend, a dozen other relatives and friends. The table was set. Candles lit. There was no empty chair. I knocked. The sound seemed to kill the music instantly. When Marilyn opened the door, she didn't look happy to see me. She looked inconvenienced. She held a glass of wine to her chest, shielding herself from my intrusion. "Oh, Claire," she said, "we thought you were working. You're always working." She didn't step aside to let me in. She stood in the doorway, blocking the warmth while the sleet hit my face. Behind her, I saw Graham glance over, see me, and immediately turn his back to refill his drink. They hadn't forgotten I existed. They had simply decided that the picture of their perfect family looked better without me in the frame. I didn't yell. I didn't cry. I handed her the bag of gifts, turned, walked back to my car, and drove 4 hours back to my empty apartment in the city. That was the night I realized that hoping for them to change was a liability I could no longer afford. In my line of work, when a client refuses to mitigate a risk, you drop the client. So, this year, I dropped them. The preparation took 11 months. It was a forensic dismantling of my previous life. I changed my phone number, registering the new one under a burner app that routed through 3 different servers. I set up a post office box in a town 40 miles away. I scrubbed my social media, locking down every account, removing every tag. I vanished from the digital world as thoroughly as I had vanished from their dinner table. I even instructed my HR department at High-End to flag any external inquiries about my employment status as security threats. And then, I bought the house. It was a manor in Glen Haven, a town that smelled of pine needles and old money that had long since stopped flaunting itself. The house was an architectural beast built in the 1920s, sitting on 4 acres bordered by dense, uninviting forest. Stone walls, 2 feet thick. Iron gates that groaned like dying animals. It wasn't a cozy house. It was a fortress. I bought it for $1.2 million, but I didn't use my name. I formed a limited liability company called Nemesis Holdings, paying the filing fees in cash. I hired a lawyer who specialized in privacy trust to handle the closing. On the deed, the owner was a faceless entity. On tax records, a blind trust. To the world, and specifically to Graham and Marilyn Caldwell, Claire Lopez was a ghost. I told no one, not my few friends, not my colleagues. The silence was the most expensive thing I had ever bought, and I savored it. Now, it's December 23rd. The air in Glen Haven is sharp enough to cut glass. I'm standing at the end of the driveway, looking up at the house. My house. It looms against the gray sky, a silhouette of sharp angles and dark slate. The windows are dark because I haven't turned the lights on. I like the darkness. It feels honest. I'm wrapped in a heavy wool coat, leather gloves on. My breath plumes in front of me. I've spent the last 3 days here alone. Thousands of dollars spent on supplies, a freezer full of steaks and good wine, a library full of books I've meant to read for 5 years, a fireplace in the main hall large enough to roast a whole hog, though I plan to use it only to burn the few remaining photographs of my childhood. For the first time in my life, the silence around me isn't a result of exclusion. It's a result of selection. I chose this. I built this wall. I walk up the stone steps to the front door. The key is heavy brass, cold in my hand. When I unlock the door and step inside, the air is still, smelling faintly of cedar and dust. I don't feel lonely. I feel fortified. I walk through the grand foyer, my boots clicking on the marble floor. I pass the dining room where a long mahogany table sits empty. I run my hand along the back of a chair. No turkey hair. No forced laughter. No parents looking through me as if I'm made of glass. I move to the kitchen, a cavernous space with industrial appliances I barely know how to use. I pour myself a glass of water from the tap and lean against the granite island. It's quiet. So incredibly quiet. I think about what they're doing right now. It's the 23rd, so Marilyn is likely micromanaging the placement of ornaments on their 12-foot tree. Graham is probably in his study, hiding from the holiday chaos, checking his bank accounts, worrying about the debt he tries so hard to hide. Derek is probably already drunk or high or both, breaking something valuable he'll blame on the maid. They are probably wondering why I haven't called. Or maybe they aren't. Maybe they are relieved. Maybe they are telling their friends, with a sigh of long-suffering martyrdom, that Claire has gone off the rails again. Claire is having one of her episodes. Claire is just so difficult to love. Let them talk. Their words cannot reach me here. I am behind stone walls. I am behind a trust fund shield. I am invisible. I finish my water and decide to inspect the perimeter. It's a habit from work. Assess the vulnerabilities. Check the exits. I walk out the back door onto the terrace overlooking the overgrown garden. Snow is falling softly now, large flakes sticking to the stone balustrade. The woods beyond are a wall of black and white. It's beautiful, in a stark, brutal way. This is what I wanted. A Christmas that belongs to me. A holiday that isn't an obligation or a performance. I've spent 35 years waiting for someone to give me permission to be happy, to take up space. Standing here, in the shadow of this massive house that I bought with my own money, earned from cleaning up other people's disasters, I realize the truth. You don't ask for permission. You take it. You sign the deed. You wire the funds. And you lock the gate behind you. I take a deep breath, filling my lungs with the icy air. I feel a strange sensation in my chest. It takes me a moment to identify it. It is pride. Cold, hard, solitary pride. I turn back to go inside, planning to light the fire in the library and open a bottle of Cabernet that cost $300. I'm going to sit in a leather chair and read until my eyes burn. I'm going to sleep until noon. I'm going to exist loudly and unapologetically in this empty house. And then I hear it. Faint at first, carried on the wind whipping down the valley. The low, steady hum of an engine. I freeze, my hand on the doorknob. This road is a dead end. No neighbors for 2 miles. The only reason to be on this road is if you're coming here. I wait. The sound grows louder. Not the rattle of a delivery truck or the high whine of a sedan. It's the heavy, throaty rumble of large vehicles. SUVs. Expensive ones. I step back into the shadow of the doorway, my heart kicking a sudden, violent rhythm against my ribs. I check my watch. 4 in the afternoon. The light is failing fast. The sound gets closer, crunching over the packed snow of the private drive. I move through the house, keeping the lights off, and go to the front window in the foyer. The heavy velvet drapes are drawn, but I pull back the edge just an inch. Through the iron bars of the main gate, I see headlights cutting through the gloom. Not one pair. Two. 2 black SUVs slow down and come to a halt right in front of my gate. They sit there for a moment, engines idling, exhaust pumping gray clouds into the winter air. Then the doors open. I watch as a man steps out of the first car. Even from this distance, even through the falling snow, I know the shape of that coat. I know the arrogant tilt of that head. It is Graham. My stomach drops, not with fear, but with a sudden, hot rage. How? How did they find me? I covered every track. I sealed every leak. Then a second figure emerges from the passenger's side. Marilyn. She's wrapped in fur, looking up at the house, not with awe, but with a critical, possessive squint. And from the back seat of the second car, Derek stumbles out, looking at his phone. But it's the fourth person who makes my blood run cold. A man in blue coveralls gets out of a white van that pulls up behind the SUVs. He walks around to the back of his van and pulls out a heavy red toolbox. He walks toward the gate, not tentatively, but with purpose. He approaches the electronic keypad of my gate, the one I coded myself just yesterday. Graham points at the gate. The man in coveralls nods and pulls out a drill. They didn't come to knock. They didn't come to ring the bell. They brought a locksmith. They are not here to visit. They are here to break in. I let the curtain fall back into place. The silence of the house is no longer peaceful. It is the silence of a held breath before the scream. I step back from the window, and for the first time in a year, I feel that old, familiar feeling of being small. But then I look at the deed to the house, sitting on the hall table. I look at the security panel on the wall. They think I'm the daughter who waits on the stairs for scraps. They think this is a family dispute. I reach into my pocket and pull out my phone. I do not call them. I do not go out to greet them. I watch the red light on the security panel blink. Let them try. They have no idea who lives here now. I watch them through the wrought iron bars of the gate. The metal was freezing against my palm, biting into the leather of my gloves, but I held onto it as if it were the only thing keeping reality anchored. The 2 SUVs sat idling, their exhaust pipes puffing gray smoke into the crisp air of Glen Haven. Behind them, a white utility van with the word precision lock and key stenciled on the side completed the convoy. The driver's door of the lead SUV opened, and my father stepped out. Graham Caldwell didn't step onto the snow-dusted pavement like a man visiting his estranged daughter for the holidays. He stepped out like a general surveying a battlefield he had already won. He adjusted the collar of his cashmere coat, buttoned it over his paunch, and looked up at the manor house with a gaze that was entirely devoid of wonder. He was assessing it. He was calculating square footage, heating costs, and market value. The passenger door opened, and Marilyn emerged. She was already in character. I could see it in the way she hunched her shoulders, pulling her fur coat tighter around herself, appearing smaller and more fragile than she actually was. She looked up at the house, then at me standing behind the gate, and I saw her hand go to her mouth. It was a gesture of theatrical shock, practiced to perfection in front of mirrors for decades. Her eyes were already glistening. She had likely started working up the tears the moment they crossed the town line. And then there was Derek. My younger brother climbed out of the back seat of the second SUV. He didn't look at me. He didn't look at the house's beauty or the menacing gray sky. He was looking at his phone, then at the utility pole down the street, and then at the thick conduit lines running along the side of the manor's perimeter wall. He wore a hoodie under a blazer, his attempt at tech entrepreneur chic, and he looked wired, his eyes darting with a frantic, greedy energy. I did not press the button to open the gate. I stood my ground, the cold wind whipping my hair across my face. Graham walked up to the gate, stopping 2 feet away. He didn't say hello. He didn't say Merry Christmas. He simply nodded, as if acknowledging an employee who had arrived late to a meeting. "Open it up, Claire," he said. "It's freezing out here." I stared at him. The audacity was so pure, so unadulterated, that it was almost impressive. "How did you find me?" I asked. My voice was calm, which surprised me. I had expected it to shake. Graham sighed, a puff of white air escaping his lips. He looked annoyed that he had to explain himself. "You're not a ghost, Claire. You're sloppy. You posted a photo on that architecture forum 3 months ago. A close-up of a gargoyle on the east cornice. You asked for advice on limestone restoration." I felt a cold pit open in my stomach. I remembered that post. I had used a burner account. I had cropped the background. Graham smiled, a thin, tight expression. "You didn't scrub the metadata," he said. "And even if you had, that gargoyle is unique to the Vanderhoven estate. It took Derek about 10 minutes to cross-reference it. You really should be more careful if you're trying to hide from the people who love you." Love. The word hung in the air like a foul smell. "Why are you here?" I asked. Marilyn stepped forward then, flanking Graham. She reached through the bars, her fingers grasping at the end near my arm. "Oh, Claire," she choked out, her voice wobbling with a vibrato that would have won awards on daytime television. "How can you ask that? It's Christmas. Families belong together at Christmas. We couldn't let you spend it all alone in this mausoleum." Her eyes darted over my shoulder to the house again, and the grief in her expression momentarily flickered into appraisal. "It's very big, isn't it? Much too big for one person. You must be terrified." "I'm not terrified," I said. "And I am not alone. I am solitary. There is a difference. Go away." I turned to walk back toward the house, but Derek's voice stopped me. It was not emotional. It was purely logistical. "Hey, the voltage here is industrial, right?" he shouted from near the van. "The listing said the previous owner had a kill. That means 3-phase power." I stopped and turned back. Derek wasn't looking at me. He was signaling to the driver of the second SUV to pop the trunk. "What are you doing?" I asked. Derek didn't answer. He just waved his hand, and the trunk flew open. Inside, I saw them. Computer towers. Not standard desktops, but open-air rig frames dense with graphics cards and cooling fans. Mining rigs. Service. The blinking, heating, energy-sucking leeches that had caused him to be evicted from his last 3 apartments. Graham answered for him. "Derek needs a place to set up his hardware, Claire. His startup is in a critical phase. He needs a stable environment with high amperage and low ambient temperature. A basement in a stone house in winter is perfect." "He is not setting up anything here," I said, walking back to the bars. "This is my property. You are trespassing. Leave now." Graham chuckled darkly. He reached into the inside pocket of his coat. He pulled out a folded document. It was thick, legal-sized paper, stapled at the corner. Actually, he said, smoothing the paper against the iron gate so I could see it, we are not trespassing. We are tenants. I squinted at the document. The header was standard boilerplate for a residential lease. But my eyes widened as I scanned the terms. Tenant, Derek Caldwell and Graham Caldwell. Premises, basement level and auxiliary power grid of 440, Blackwood Lane. Rent, $1 per month. Term, 99 years. And there, at the bottom, was a signature. It was my signature. The loop of the C. The sharp strike of the L. The way the E trailed off. It was a perfect replication of the signature I had used on my college loans, the one Graham had co-signed years ago. I stayed at it, my breath catching in my throat. I never signed that. Graham shrugged, folding the paper back up and sliding it into his pocket. It's right here, Claire. Signed and dated last week. Maybe you forgot. You've been under a lot of stress lately. This is insanity, I said, my voice rising. That is a forgery. I will call the police. Go ahead, Graham said, his voice dropping to a low, menacing register. Call them. Show them your deed. Show them this lease. It's a civil matter, Claire. Do you know how long it takes to evict a tenant with a signed lease in this state? Especially family members. During the holidays? Months, maybe a year. By the time a judge looks at this, Derek will have mined enough crypto to buy this town. Or he'll have burned the house down. Either way, we're moving in. He turned his back on me and gestured to the white van. The man in the blue coveralls, the locksmith, stepped out. He looked hesitant, shifting his weight from one foot to the other. He was holding a heavy cordless drill and a case of tension wrenches. Mr. Caldwell, the locksmith asked, looking at the gate and then at me. The lady says she didn't sign anything. Graham walked over to the locksmith and put a hand on the man's shoulder. His voice changed instantly. It became warm, paternal, and deeply, deeply sad. I'm so sorry you have to see this, son, Graham said, shaking his head. My daughter, she's having an episode. She has struggled with mental health issues for years. She goes off her medication. She disappears. She buys these strange places and locks herself in. We're just trying to get her home. We have a lease. We have the medical power of attorney pending. We just need to get inside before she hurts herself. The locksmith looked at me. I stood there, stiff with rage, my hands clenched into fists. To a stranger, I probably did look rigid. I probably looked manic. Marilyn chimed in, wiping a fresh tear from her cheek. Please, she said to the locksmith. She's all alone in there. She thinks we're the enemy. It's the paranoia talking. Please, just open the gate so we can take care of our little girl. The locksmith looked at Marilyn's tears, then at Graham's expensive coat and calm demeanor, and then at me, the woman standing alone in the cold, refusing to open the gate for her crying mother on Christmas. He made his choice. I'm sorry, the locksmith said to me, his voice apologetic but firm. I got to listen to the legal guardians here. If you're sick, you need help. He walked toward the control box of the gate, raising his drill. Derek had already started moving. He and the driver of the second SUV were lifting a heavy server rack out of the trunk, setting it onto the snowy pavement with a metallic clatter. They weren't waiting for the gate to open. They were staging the equipment, treating the sidewalk like a loading dock. I watched them. I watched Derek check the connections on the back of a server, completely ignoring the drama unfolding 5 feet away. I watched Marilyn dab her eyes and check her reflection in the SUV window. I watched Graham check his watch as if calculating how long the drilling would take so he could schedule his dinner. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. They hadn't come for me. They hadn't tracked me down because they missed me at the dinner table. They didn't care about the empty chair. They needed a warehouse. Derek's business was failing, or illegal, or both, and he needed a place with high power capacity and zero oversight to run his machines. Graham and Marilyn needed to be the heroes who saved their son, and they needed a location that cost them nothing. They saw my post about the manor, saw the size of it, and saw a resource to be exploited. The $1 rent wasn't a joke. It was a strategy. They were establishing residency. If they got those machines into my basement, if they slept one night under this roof, they would have tenants' rights. They would force me to take them to court, bleeding me dry with legal fees while they lived in my house, ate my food, and used my electricity to fuel Derek's delusions. This wasn't a family reunion. It was an invasion. A hostile takeover disguised as a holiday miracle. The drill word to life. A high-pitched scream that cut through the silence of the woods. The locksmith pressed the bit against the metal housing of my gate's control panel. I stepped back from the gate. I did not scream. I did not beg. I looked at Graham. He was watching the drill with a satisfied smirk. He thought he had won. He thought the paper in his pocket was a shield that could deflect anything I threw at him. He thought I was still the 7-year-old girl waiting on the stairs. I took my phone out of my pocket. I snapped a picture of the locksmith drilling the lock. I snapped a picture of Derek unloading the servers on the public easement. I snapped a picture of Graham holding the forged lease against the gate. Graham looked up, his smirk faltering slightly. "What are you doing, Claire? Put the phone away." I didn't answer. I turned around and started walking back toward the heavy oak front doors of the manor. "Where are you going?" Marilyn called out, her voice sharpening, the concerned mother mask slipping for a fraction of a second. "Claire, come back here." I reached the front door, opened it, and stepped into the foyer. I looked back one last time. The locksmith was working fast. The gate would be open in 5 minutes. I stepped inside and slammed the heavy door, throwing the deadbolt. Then I engaged the secondary lock, a heavy iron bar that slid across the frame. I walked to the center of the hallway. My hands were shaking, not from cold, but from adrenaline. They wanted to play with the law. They wanted to use paper as a weapon. I looked at the grandfather clock ticking in the corner. It was 4:15 in the afternoon on December 23rd. I dialed a number on my phone. It wasn't the police. Not yet. I dialed the number for Grant Halloway, the most ruthless property attorney in the tri-state area. The game had started, but they had made a critical error. They thought they were playing against their daughter. They didn't know they were playing against the landlord. The sound of the drill biting into the brass mechanism of my front gate was a noise I would never forget. It was a high-pitched metallic scream that vibrated through the stone pillars and seemed to echo right into the hollow of my chest. Inside the foyer, I watched the security monitor with a kind of detached horror. The locksmith, a man whose name tag read Red Miller, was leaning his full weight into the tool. He was not a bad man. He was just a man doing a job, convinced by a well-dressed older couple that he was saving a damsel in distress from her own madness. I had dialed 911 the moment the drill tip touched the metal. My hand was steady as I held the phone to my ear, but my heart was hammering a frantic rhythm against my ribs. I gave the dispatcher the address, 440 Blackwood Lane. I told her there was an active break-in. I told her there were 4 intruders attempting to bypass a security gate. I did not tell her they were my parents. I did not tell her the intruders were wearing cashmere and driving luxury SUVs. In the eyes of the law, trespass was trespass. When the patrol car rolled up the long, snowy approach 5 minutes later, I felt a surge of relief that was immediately followed by a wave of nausea. The vehicle was a county sheriff cruiser, splattered with road salt. The officer who stepped out was young, perhaps late 20s, with a face flushed from the biting cold. He adjusted his belt as he approached the group gathered at my gate. I threw on my coat and walked out the front door. I did not run. I walked. Every step had to be measured. If I looked frantic, I validated their story. If I looked calm, I stood a chance. By the time I reached the interior side of the gate, Graham had already intercepted the officer. My father has a way of speaking to men in uniform. He adopts a posture of deferential authority, a tone that says, "I respect your badge, but we both know I pay the taxes that fund your salary, officer." Graham was saying, his voice smooth and reasonable. "Thank God you're here. We were about to call you ourselves. We have a bit of a domestic crisis." The officer looked from Graham to the locksmith, who had paused his drilling, and then to me standing on the other side of the bars. The officer asked, addressing me, "Is this your property?" "Yes," I said, my voice cutting through the wind. "My name is Claire Lopez. I'm the sole resident. These people are trespassing. I want them removed." Marilyn let out a sob. It was a perfect, strangled sound. She stepped forward, clutching a handkerchief. "Officer, please," she said. "That is my daughter. She is not well. We have been trying to reach her for weeks. She stopped taking her calls. She stopped taking her medication. We just want to make sure she is safe. I am not on medication, I said, keeping my eyes on the officer, and I am perfectly safe. I am being harassed. Graham shook his head sadly. See, that's the paranoia. She thinks everyone is out to get her. Look, officer, we don't want to make a scene. We just want to get our son settled in. We have a lease. Graham pulled the folded document from his pocket again. The fatal piece of paper. He handed it to the officer with the confidence of a man handing over a winning lottery ticket. The officer took it. He unfolded it, his flashlight beam dancing over the text. The wind whipped the corners of the paper. I watched the officer's eyes scan the page. I saw him pause at the bottom. This looks like a standard lease agreement, the officer said, looking up at me. It is signed by Claire Lopez. Is that you? It is a forgery, I said. I never signed that. Graham sighed, a sound of immense patience wearing thin. Claire, honey, please. You signed it last Tuesday. You were lucid then. You wanted Derek to be close to you. Don't do this. He turned to the officer. She has dissociative episodes. She forgets things she has done. It's why we're here. We're just trying to move her brother into the basement unit as agreed, so someone can keep an eye on her. We're not breaking in. We're tenants exercising our right to access the property. The officer looked at the lease, then at the locksmith, then at the expensive cars, and finally at me. He saw a well-to-do family concerned for a daughter. He saw a signed legal document. He did not see a crime. He saw a headache. The officer said, handing the paper back to Graham. If there is a signed lease and you are disputing the validity of the signature, that is not something I can determine on the side of the road. That is a matter for a judge. He is lying. I said, my voice hardening. You cannot just let them break down my gate based on a piece of paper they printed at Kinko's. It looks valid on its face, the officer said, his tone shifting from investigative to dismissive. If you have a tenant dispute, you need to take it to civil court. I cannot kick people off a property if they have documentation saying they live there. But they do not live here. I almost shouted, losing my composure for a fraction of a second. And that was the mistake. Marilyn flinched as if I had struck her. Graham put a protective arm around her. She's getting agitated, Graham murmured to the officer. We should just get inside and calm her down. The officer nodded. He looked at me with pity. Look, folks, keep the noise down. Sort this out inside. If I have to come back out here for a disturbance, then we are going to have problems. But right now, this is a civil matter. He turned and walked back to his cruiser. I stood there, gripping the cold iron bars, watching the taillights of the patrol car fade into the snowy distance. The law had just looked me in the eye and shrugged. The moment the cruiser was out of sight, the performance dropped. Graham's face lost its look of concern and settled back into a smug satisfaction. Told you, Claire, he said. Civil matter. Derek did not waste a second. While we had been arguing, he had not been idle. He had been moving. He had dragged 3 more of the server racks out of the SUV and lined them up against the brick pillar of the gate. He had also done something far more insidious. He was on his phone, speaking loudly, his voice carrying over the wind. Yes, this is Derek Caldwell, he was saying. I'm the new tenant at 440 Blackwood Lane. I need to transfer the service into my name, effective immediately. Yes, the basement unit. I have the lease right here. He was establishing a paper trail. He was calling the electric company. I realized then what was happening. They were not just breaking in. They were layering reality with documentation. A lease. A police report that listed it as a civil dispute. A utility account in Derek's name. Every minute I stood here arguing was a minute they used to pour concrete around their lie. If I screamed, I was crazy. If I physically blocked them, I was assaulting a tenant. If I opened the gate, I was surrendering. I felt a cold clarity wash over me. It was the same feeling I got at High-End when I realized a project was irretrievably broken and needed to be burned to the ground to save the company. I stopped gripping the bars. I let my hands fall to my sides. I reached into my pocket and pulled out my phone. I did not call the police again. I opened the camera app. I switched to video mode. I pointed the lens at the locksmith. State your name and the name of your company, I said. My voice was flat, devoid of emotion. The locksmith looked up, startled. Precision Lock and Key. I panned the camera to the license plate of his van. I recorded it clearly. I panned to the license plates of the SUVs. I recorded them. Then I turned the camera on Graham. Graham Caldwell. I narrated for the recording, attempting an authorized entry into 440 Blackwood Lane using a forged instrument. Date is December 23rd. Time is 4:42 p.m. Graham frowned. Stop that, Claire. You're being childish. I did not stop. I zoomed in on the document in his hand. I captured the fake signature. Then I turned the camera to Derek, who was still on the phone with the utility company. Derek Caldwell, I said, attempting to fraudulently transfer utility services for a property he does not own and does not reside in. Derek flipped a middle finger at the camera. I captured that, too. I was building a file. In my world, the person with the best documentation wins. They were playing a game of emotional manipulation and physical intimidation. I was about to play a game of liability. Open the gate, Claire, Graham said, losing his patience. The officers said we can come in. The locksmith is going to drill it anyway. You're just costing yourself money. I lowered the phone but kept it recording. I looked Graham in the eye. You are right, I said. The officers said it's a civil matter. That means he won't arrest you for entering, but it also means he won't arrest me for what I do next. I turned my back on them. Where are you going? Marilyn shrieked. I did not answer. I walked back up the driveway. The snow was crunching under my boots. Behind me, I heard the drill start up again. The high-pitched whine was the sound of my privacy dying. I reached the heavy oak doors of the manor. I stepped inside and locked them. Then I locked the inner vestibulary door. Then I went to the keypad on the wall and armed the internal motion sensors. I walked into the library. It was dark, illuminated only by the gray light filtering through the tall windows. I sat down at the heavy mahogany desk I had bought at an auction 3 days ago. I opened my laptop. I created a new folder on the desktop. I named it Incident December 23rd. I uploaded the video I had just taken. I uploaded the photos from earlier. They were going to get through the gate. It would take the locksmith maybe 10 minutes. Then they would drive up to the house. They would try the front door. They would find it locked. They would probably have the locksmith drill that too. They would get inside. They would haul their servers into the basement. They would unpack their bags in the guest rooms. They would open my wine and sit on my furniture and congratulate themselves on handling the Claire situation. They thought they had one because they had forced their way in. They thought possession was 9/10 of the law. But they had forgotten what I do for a living. I don't fight in the street. I fight in the fine print. I picked up my phone again. My hands were perfectly steady now. The rage had distilled into something potent and clay. I scrolled through my contacts until I found the name I needed, Grant Holloway. He was not a family lawyer. He was a shark who specialized in high-stakes property litigation and corporate hostile takeovers. He cost $600 an hour, and he was worth every penny. I pressed call. It rang once, twice. A gravelly voice answered. It was holiday week, but men like Grant never really stopped working. Grant, it's Claire Lopez, I said. Claire, Grant said, his tone shifting to professional curiosity. I thought you were off the grid enjoying the new fortress. The fortress has been breached, I said. I looked at the monitor on my desk. I could see the gate swinging open. The 2 SUVs were rolling through. The invasion had officially begun. My parents and my brother have just entered the grounds. They have a forged lease with my signature on it. The local police declared it a civil matter and left. They are bringing in industrial mining equipment. There was a silence on the other end of the line, a heavy, thoughtful silence. Then I heard the sound of a chair squeaking, as if Grant was sitting up straighter. A forged lease? Grant asked. And they are moving in? Yes, I said. They are claiming tenancy. Okay, Grant said. That is bold. Stupid, but bold. Do you want me to file for an emergency eviction? No, I said. An eviction takes too long. They know that. They want to drag this out for months. Then what do you want? Grant asked. I watched on the screen as Graham stepped out of his car in front of my house. He looked up at the windows, claiming his prize. I want to destroy them, Grant. I want to use every zoning law, every preservation ordinance, and every clause in the trust agreement to crush them. I want them to regret the day they learned to spell my name. I heard a low chuckle on the other end of the line. Music to my ears, Grant said. Send me everything you have. I hung up the phone. Downstairs, I heard the heavy thud of a fist pounding on the front door. Claire. Graham's voice, muffled by the thick oak. Open up. Stop being dramatic. I did not move. I sat in the dark library, the glow of my laptop screen illuminating my face. Now, I whispered to the empty room. Now it is their turn. The heavy oak door vibrated against my back. On the other side, Graham was pounding with the flat of his hand, a rhythmic, demanding thud that sounded less like a knock and more like ownership asserting itself. I could hear the high-pitched whine of the drill starting up again. The locksmith was attacking the deadbolt. They were seconds away from breaching the sanctuary I had spent my life savings to secure. I stood in the dim foyer, my phone pressed to my ear, my heart beating with a cold, hard precision. Grant, I said, they are at the door. The locksmith is drilling. Put me on speaker, Grant Holloway said. His voice was gravel over velvet, the sound of a man who ate conflict for breakfast. And open the door. Open it. I asked, disbelief in my voice. Trust me, Grant said. Do you see the police officer? He left, I said. He called it a civil matter. He didn't leave far, Grant said. I just called the dispatch supervisor and explained the situation. He should be rolling back up your driveway right now. Open the door. Claire, let's end this. I took a deep breath. I reached out and unlocked the secondary internal latch. Then I turned the heavy brass knob. The door swung open. Graham stumbled forward, his fist mid-air, caught off balance by the sudden lack of resistance. Marilyn was standing behind him, shivering in her fur, her face a mask of tragic suffering. Derek was behind them, filming with his phone, a smirk plastered on his face. The locksmith was on his knees, drill in hand, looking up with guilt written all over his face. Claire! Graham shouted, regaining his composure. He straightened his coat. Finally, you're making this incredibly difficult for everyone. I did not step back. I stood in the doorway, blocking the entrance with my body. I held my phone up in front of me like a shield. Officer, the first called out, looking past them. The patrol car had indeed returned. It was idling silently behind the two black SUVs, its lights flashing red and blue against the gray dusk. The young officer was walking toward us, looking annoyed and tired. I thought I told you folks to settle this inside, the officer said, his hand resting on his belt. They are breaking in, I stated clearly. Officer, I continued, my lawyer would like a word. I tapped the speaker icon on my phone and held it out. Who is this? Graham demanded, looking at the phone with disdain. This is Grant Holloway. Grant's voice boomed from the tiny speaker. It was loud enough to cut through the wind. I represent the Glen Haven Preservation Trust. Graham laughed, a short, dismissive bark. We don't care about your trust. We have a lease signed by the owner. Officer, Grant continued, ignoring my father completely. Please ask Mr. Caldwell to show you the lease again. Specifically, look at the name of the landlord. The officer looked at Graham, looking irritated, pulled the folded paper from his pocket. It's signed by Claire Lopez, Graham said, thrusting it toward the officer. My daughter, the woman standing right there. She owns the house. She leased the basement to us. Officer, Grant said, his voice dropping an octave, becoming dangerous. I want you to verify the deed of the property located at 440 Blackwood Lane. You can do it on your dispatch computer, or I can email you the certified copy right now. The officer looked at me, then at the phone. Hold on, he said. He pulled out his radio. Dispatch, run a property check on 440 Blackwood. Need the listed owner. We waited. The wind howled around the corners of the manor. Marilyn wrapped her arms around herself. Claire, stop this, she hissed. You're embarrassing us. The radio crackled. Dispatch to Unit 4. Property owner is listed as the Glen Haven Preservation Trust. Tax ID number 45990. The officer frowned. He looked at the lease in Graham's hand. Then he looked at me. Grant's voice came through the phone again, sharp as a razor. Claire Lopez does not own that house, officer. The Glen Haven Preservation Trust owns it. Miss Lopez is merely the court-appointed administrator and resident trustee. She has no legal authority to lease any portion of that property to a private party for commercial cryptocurrency mining. Even if that signature were real, which it is not, the contract is invalid from the start. You cannot lease what you do not own. I watched the realization wash over Graham's face. It was slow, like a stain spreading on fabric. He looked at the paper in his hand, then at me. But you bought it, he stammered. You said you bought a manor. I bought a controlling interest in a trust, I said, my voice steady. For privacy and for protection. Furthermore, officer, Grant continued, delivering the final blow. Since the lease is a forgery attempting to gain access to corporate property, this is no longer a domestic civil dispute. This is attempted corporate fraud and criminal trespass. The Glen Haven Preservation Trust does not have a family relationship with Mr. Caldwell. We are requesting you remove these individuals from the premises immediately, or we will be filing charges against your department for aiding and abetting a felony. The officer's demeanor changed instantly. The family dispute gray area had vanished. He was now dealing with a black and white property crime involving a corporate entity. He stepped forward, his hand moving away from his belt and gesturing toward the SUVs. Mr. Caldwell, the officer said, his voice hard. I need you to step away from the door. Now wait a minute, Graham sputtered, his face turning a mottled red. This is a technicality. She is my daughter, sir. The deed says a trust owns this house. Your lease is with a person who doesn't hold the title. That paper is worthless. You are trespassing on corporate land. Pack it up now. Marilyn let out a wail, but it was cut short when the officer turned his gaze on her. Get in the car. Derek, who had been silent, suddenly lunged forward. But my servers. We moved them. The temperature is perfect. Get them off the sidewalk, the officer ordered. If they are not gone in 10 minutes, I'm calling a tow truck for the vehicles, and I am arresting all three of you. The locksmith, realizing he had been inches away from committing a felony, packed his drill into his bag with lightning speed. Sorry, he muttered to me, not making eye contact, and practically ran to his van. I stood in the doorway, watching them unravel. The power dynamic had shifted so violently that the air felt charged. Graham looked at me. For the first time in my life, he didn't look at me with indifference or disappointment. He looked at me with hate. He took a step toward me. The officer moved to intercept, but Graham stopped. You would do this to your family. Graham hissed. On Christmas, you would hide behind a lawyer and a trust just to keep your brother from getting back on his feet. I looked him dead in the eye. I'm not hiding, Graham, I said. I'm evicting. Talk to my lawyer, I added, echoing the phrase he had used on his own business partners 1,000 times. Graham stared at me for a long moment. Then he spat on the stone step at my feet. Let's go, he said to Marilyn. They retreated. It was a chaotic, angry retreat. Derek was cursing, shoving the heavy server racks back into the trunk of the SUV, scratching the paint in his haste. Marilyn was weeping loudly, asking the empty air what she had done to deserve such a cruel child. Graham was on his phone, likely yelling at his own lawyer, who was probably telling him exactly what Grant had just said. I watched them until the last door slammed. I watched the taillights flare red as they reversed down the drive. The officer waited until they were through the gate before he gave me a curt nod and followed them out. I was alone. I let out a breath I felt like I had been holding for 20 years. My knees felt weak. I leaned against the door frame, closing my eyes. I did it, I whispered. Grant was still on the phone. Are they gone? He asked. Yes, I said. They are gone. Good, Grant said. I will draft a cease and desist order tonight and have it served to their home address tomorrow morning. Lock the door, Claire, and check the perimeter. I hung up. I pushed the heavy door shut and threw the deadbolt. The sound of the lock clicking into place was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. I turned to walk back into the main hall, and then the lights went out. It wasn't just a flicker. It was a hard, instant death of every bulb in the house. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen died. The security panel by the door went dark. The boiler in the basement groaned and fell silent. Total, absolute darkness. I stood frozen in the pitch-black foyer. The silence was sudden and heavy. I pulled out my phone and turned on the flashlight. The beam cut through the dusty air. I walked to the window. Outside, down at the edge of the property where the main utility pole stood, I saw the taillights of the second SUV, Derek's SUV, pausing for just a second before speeding away. I knew exactly what had happened. Derek hadn't just been looking at the power lines earlier. He had been casing them. He knew where the external disconnect was. On his way out, in a fit of petty, vindictive rage, he had pulled the main breaker. Or worse, he had smashed the box. I walked to the thermostat. The display was blank. The house, built of stone and vast empty spaces, was already beginning to hold the chill. The heat was gone. The security cameras were down. The electric gate was frozen in the open position. I was alone in a 4,000-square-foot manor in the middle of a snowstorm, with no heat, no light, and the front gate wide open to the world. I wrapped my coat tighter around myself. I could feel the cold seeping up through the floorboards. It felt familiar. It felt like every Christmas Eve I had spent in my apartment, staring at a phone that never rang. It felt like the coldness of their dining room when they looked right through me. They couldn't stay, so they made sure I couldn't stay comfortably either. They wanted to punish me. They wanted me to freeze. They wanted me to be scared in the dark so I would come crawling back to them, begging for forgiveness, begging to be let back into the warmth of their toxic circle. I shined the flashlight on my breath, which was already misting in the air. I did not call an electrician. It was Christmas Eve. No one would come. I did not cry. I walked into the library. I found the candles I had bought, thick, heavy pillars of beeswax. I lit them one by one, and the room filled with flickering, dancing shadows. I went to the fireplace. I stacked the dry oak logs I had prepared. I struck a match and watched the kindling catch. The fire roared to life, casting a golden glow over the leather books and the dark wood paneling. It was primitive. It was cold. But it was mine. I sat down at the desk. My laptop had 4 hours of battery life left. I tethered it to my phone's hotspot. I opened the folder I had created earlier. Incident December 23rd. I looked at the files, the video of the locksmith, the photo of the forged lease, the recording of Graham claiming ownership. They thought this was over because they had left. They thought cutting the power was the final word, a petty vandalism to show they still had power over me. They were wrong. I created a new subfolder. I named it Utility Sabotage. I typed a note to Grant, add malicious destruction of property and endangerment to the list. Derek pulled the mains on his way out. Temperature is dropping. I'm staying. I hit send. Then I opened a blank document. I stayed at the blinking cursor. I began to type. Not a legal brief. Not a diary entry. I began to type a timeline. December 23rd, 1600. Trespass initiated. December 23rd, 1645. Forgery presented to law enforcement. December 23rd, 1710. Utility sabotage confirmed. I looked at the fire. The flames reflected in the dark window glass. Merry Christmas, Claire, I said to the empty room. I cracked my knuckles. I had plenty of battery life, and I had a lot of work to do. The temperature in the library had dropped to 48 degrees Fahrenheit by the time the sun began to bleed a pale, watery light through the heavy velvet curtains. I had not slept. I had spent the night feeding the fire with the methodical precision of a machine, baiting through the stack of oak logs I had intended to last a week. I was wrapped in 2 blankets, my breath pluming in the air like dragon smoke. But my mind was sharp. It was the kind of clarity that comes from adrenaline and cold, a hyper-awareness of every creak in the old house and every vibration of the phone on the desk. At 8:15 in the morning, the phone finally rang. It was not a local number. It was a 1-800 number. The caller ID read Regional Power and Electric. I picked it up on the first ring. "This is Claire Lopez," I said. "Good morning, Miss Lopez," a chipper, automated-sounding voice replied. "This is Sarah from customer service. We are calling to verify the transfer of service request for 440 Blackwood Lane. We just need a final voice authorization to finalize the switch to the new account holder." I sat up straighter, the blanket falling from my shoulders. I did not request a transfer, I said. I am the account holder. The account stays in my name. There was a pause on the other end, the sound of typing. Oh, I see. Well, we have a request here submitted online at 4:30 this morning. It's requesting the service be moved to a Mr. Derek Caldwell. The application has all the requisite verification data. My blood ran cold, colder than the room. Verification data. I asked, what data? Well, the representative said, hesitant now. He provided the social security number associated with the property file, the mother's maiden name, and the previous 2 addresses on file for the primary resident. It all matched our records for you. That's why the system flagged it for a quick approval. I closed my eyes. Of course, he had it. Or rather, she had it. Marilyn kept a fireproof box in her closet. It contained the birth certificates, the social security cards, the vaccination records, and the old report cards of both her children. I had asked for my documents years ago when I moved out, and she had claimed she couldn't find them, that they were lost in a move. I had been forced to order duplicates from the state, but they weren't lost. She had kept them. She had kept my identity in a box, ready to be handed over to her golden boy the moment he needed a boost. She had given him my social security number so he could steal my electricity. Cancel the request, Sarah, I said, my voice deadly calm. That is a fraudulent application. Derek Caldwell does not reside here. He has no legal claim to this property. If you switch that service, I will sue your company for facilitating identity theft. Okay, I'm flagging it now, the representative said, her cheerful demeanor gone. We will lock the account, but if he has your full information, I know, I said. I will handle it. I hung up. I did not scream. I did not throw the phone. I opened my laptop. The battlefield had shifted. Yesterday, it was a physical invasion at the gate. Today, it was a paper war. They were trying to erase me from my own life, bit by bit. I went to the website for Equifax first, then Experian, then TransUnion. I initiated a total credit freeze on all 3 bureaus. It cost me nothing but 10 minutes of typing, but it slammed the door on any loans, credit cards, or utility accounts Derek might try to open in my name. Then I went to the federal government's identity theft portal. I filed a report. I listed my brother as the perpetrator. I listed my mother as the accomplice who provided the sensitive data. I detailed the attempt to transfer the utilities. When I hit submit, the site generated a recovery plan, and more importantly, an official FTC case number. I wrote that number down on a sticky note and stuck it to my laptop screen. That number was a shield. The next time the police tried to tell me this was a civil matter, I would give them a federal case number for felony identity fraud. But the assault was not just financial. It was reputational. My phone pinged. Then it pinged again. Then it started vibrating continuously. I picked it up. I had 6 missed calls from numbers I didn't recognize. I had 12 text messages from relatives I hadn't spoken to in a decade. Claire, how could you? One read. Your mother is distraught. Call her. Read another. I opened the Facebook app. I hadn't posted in years, but I still had the account to monitor public sentiment for work. There it was. It was shared by my Aunt Linda, my cousin Sarah, and 3 of Marilyn's Bridge Club friends. Marilyn had posted a photo. It was a picture of me from 5 years ago, looking tired and pale after a bout of the flu. In the photo, I looked unhinged, disheveled. The caption was a masterpiece of weaponized victimhood. Please pray for our family this Christmas, Marilyn wrote. We drove all the way to Glen Haven to surprise our daughter Claire with gifts and love. We found her in a dark, empty mansion, completely out of touch with reality. She refused to let us in. She refused to let us help her. She even called the police on her own father and brother, who were just trying to fix her heater. We stood in the snow for hours begging her to let us help. But she has shut us out. We are heartbroken. Mental illness is a silent thief. Please, if anyone knows how to reach her, tell her we love her and we just want her to be safe. It had 140 likes. The comments were a river of toxic sympathy. So ungrateful, wrote a woman named Beatrice. After all you have done for her. Kids these days have no respect, wrote a man I didn't know, leaving her parents in the snow. Shameful. Stay strong, Marilyn. You are a saint for trying, wrote another. I felt a surge of bile in my throat. It was a perfect narrative. She had taken my boundary, my refusal to be abused, and twisted it into a symptom of insanity. She was using the stigma of mental health to discredit me, to make sure that if I spoke up, no one would believe the crazy daughter in the big empty house. I hovered my finger over the reply button. I wanted to type the truth. I wanted to post a video of the locksmith. I wanted to post a forged lease. I wanted to scream that I was the one with the job, the house, and the sanity, and they were the parasites. But I stopped. In my line of work, we have a saying, never wrestle with a pig. You both get dirty, and the pig likes it. If I argued, I looked defensive. If I fought back in the comments, I looked unstable. I took a screenshot of the post. I took screenshots of every comment that mentioned my address or made a threat. I took a screenshot of the timestamp. I opened my evidence folder. I created a new subfolder, defamation social media. I dropped the files in. This was not just gossip. This was a coordinated campaign to damage my reputation and character. In a court of law, this was evidence of malicious intent. Marilyn thought she was winning the court of public opinion. I was letting her build the gallows for her own credibility. Then a text came in from a blocked number. You will regret this. We are not leaving until we get what is ours. It was Derek. He was too cowardly to use his own phone, but the cadence was his. What is ours, not what is yours. To them, everything I achieved was community property, available for harvest. I did not reply. I took a screenshot. I forwarded it to Grant Halloway and to the email of the sheriff's deputy who had dismissed me yesterday. I typed a message to the deputy. Received threat from suspect Derek Caldwell following the identity theft attempt this morning. Adding to the file. If anything happens to this property, you have a suspect on record. I set the phone down. It was 10 o'clock. I needed to secure the perimeter. The house was freezing, and the darkness was a liability. I called an emergency electrician service 2 towns over. I told them I had a total system failure and needed a dispatch immediately. I told them I would pay triple the holiday rate, in cash. The van arrived at noon. The electrician was a burly man named Dave, who looked at the massive house and then at me, wrapped in blankets, with confusion. Main breaker looks smashed, Dave said after inspecting the box on the side of the house. Someone took a hammer to the master switch. That's not an accident, lady. I know, I said. Can you bypass it? I can replace it, he said. Have the parts in the truck, but it'll cost you $1,200 for the call out and the parts. Do it, I said. And Dave, I have another job for you. I pulled 4 boxes from the pile of supplies I had bought days ago. They were high-definition security cameras, small, discreet. I want you to mount these, I said. But I do not want them visible. I want one inside the vent in the foyer. I want one hidden in the corners of the porch. I want one facing the back terrace, tucked into the ivy. And I want them hardwired. No Wi-Fi that can be jammed. Dave looked at me. He looked at the smashed breaker box. He put 2 and 2 together. Ex-husband? He asked. Something like that, I said. He nodded. I'll hide them so deep a spider wouldn't find them. While Dave worked, I went back to the library. I had stopped the financial bleeding. I had secured the evidence, and I was fixing the defenses. But I still didn't understand the desperation. Why now? Why this house? Why risk a felony for a basement? Graham was greedy, but he was also risk-averse. He liked safe, easy money. This invasion was messy. It reeked of panic, and the panic was coming from Derek. I logged into a database that Hines subscribed to. It was a skip tracing tool used for background checks on high-level corporate hires. It cost $50 a search, and it pulled data from court records, land filings, and judgment dockets across all 50 states. I typed in Derek Caldwell. The screen populated. It was a sea of red flags. Derek wasn't just broke. He was drowning. There was a judgment against him in New York for $40,000 in unpaid rent on a commercial loft. There was a lien on his car. There were 3 maxed-out credit cards currently in collections. But then I found the smoking gun. 6 months ago, Derek had registered a limited liability company called Caldwell Crypto Ventures. He had taken out a secured business loan from a private equity lender, a hard money lender with a reputation for aggressive collections. The loan amount was $200,000. The collateral listed on the loan application was equipment and real estate assets. I clicked on the details. He hadn't listed the Manor. He couldn't have. He didn't own it. But the loan was due in full on January 1st. It was a balloon payment. If he didn't pay, the interest rate tripled, and the penalties kicked in. Then I saw the email correspondence attached to a lawsuit filed by one of his investors last month. Derek had promised them he was securing a state-of-the-art facility with free hydroelectric power to maximize mining efficiency. He had sold them a fantasy. He had taken their money, bought the rigs, and now he had nowhere to put them and no way to pay back the loan. He needed the Manor not just to save money on rent. He needed the address. He needed to take photos of the servers running in a secure stone facility to send to his creditors to buy more time. He needed to show them he was operational. If he couldn't show them the facility by the new year, they were going to come for him. And hard money lenders didn't send letters. They sent guys like the locksmith, but with baseball bats instead of drills. Graham and Marilyn probably didn't know about the dangerous debt. Derek had likely told them he just needed a launch pad for his brilliant business. They were protecting their genius son, unaware that he was dragging them into a criminal conspiracy. I sat back in the chair. The heat was starting to return to the house. I could hear the radiators clanking and hissing as the boiler kicked back to life downstairs. They were not just bullies. They were desperate, and desperate people make mistakes. I looked at the timeline I had written. Identity theft, fraudulent lease, utility sabotage, harassment, and now loan fraud. I could give all of this to the police. I could hand it to Grant, and he could bury them in court for the next 5 years. But that wasn't enough. Marilyn wanted to play the victim in the public square. She wanted to tell the town of Glen Haven that her daughter was a monster who left her family out in the cold. She wanted to use the community's pity as a weapon. I looked at the invitation list for the local historical society's annual Christmas mixer. I had found it on the desk when I moved in. The previous owner had been a member. I wasn't going to hide in the dark anymore. I picked up my phone and called Grant. "Is the power back on?" he asked. "Yes," I said, "and I know why they are doing it. Derek owes $200,000 to Sharks. He needs the house to prove he's solvent." Grant whistled. "That explains the forgery." He's cornered. "Grant," I said, "I want to file the restraining order, but I do not want it served by a process server in a cheap suit." "How do you want it done?" he asked. "I want it served publicly," I said. Marilyn went on Facebook and told the world I was crazy. She invited the whole town to judge me. So, I think the whole town deserves to know the truth. I paused, looking out the window at the snow-covered lawn. "I'm going to host a party." "A party?" Grant asked, his voice skeptical. "You just bought the place. You have no furniture." "I have a house," I said. "And I have a story. I'm going to invite the people who matter, the neighbors, the preservation board, the people Marilyn is trying to manipulate. And when they come back," I said, "because they will come back tonight, I want an audience." I could hear Grant smiling through the phone. "You're not just fighting back, Claire. You're setting a stage." "Exactly," I said. "If they want a drama, I will give them a finale. But this time, I am writing the script." The battlefield of small-town politics is often more vicious than a corporate boardroom, primarily because the stakes are not just money. They are history and aesthetics. Glen Haven was a town that valued its appearance above its morality. It would tolerate a quiet scandal, but it would never tolerate an eyesore. This was the leverage I needed. My family was trying to play the concerned relatives card, but they had forgotten where they were standing. They were standing in a historic preservation district, a place where painting your front door the wrong shade of red could result in a fine of $500 a day. Grant Holloway and I spent the afternoon drafting a document that was less of a complaint and more of a strategic nuclear strike. We weren't filing for a restraining order. Not yet. We were filing an emergency zoning violation report with the Glen Haven Preservation Council. The Manor at 440 Blackwood Lane was not just a house. It was a Class A protected structure. The deed came with a rider that was 40 pages long, detailing everything from the allowable decibel level of garden equipment to the specific type of mortar required for brick repairs. It was a bureaucratic nightmare for a homeowner, but for a woman trying to repel an invasion, it was a fortress. At 2 p.m., the Preservation Council held its emergency session via Zoom. I had requested the slot under the imminent threat to structural integrity clause. I sat in my library, the new camera hidden in the vent above me recording silently, and logged into the meeting. The council consisted of 5 people who looked exactly as I expected. Silver hair, stern glasses, and an air of perpetual judgment. They were the gatekeepers of Glen Haven's past. Miss Lopez, the chairwoman, a woman named Mrs. Higgins, began. We received your urgent filing regarding an authorized industrial modification. Please explain. I shared my screen. I did not show them the video of my father yelling. I showed them the photos of the server racks. These are high-density cryptographic mining units, I explained, my voice professional and detached. As you can see, my estranged relatives, Mr. Graham Caldwell and Mr. Derek Caldwell, attempted to install 20 of these units in the basement yesterday. Each unit generates approximately 70 decibels of noise and produces significant waste heat. They also attempted to bypass the residential breaker box to draw industrial-grade amperage. I paused to let the words industrial-grade sink in. In a residential preservation zone, that word was profanity. Mrs. Higgins leaned closer to her webcam, her eyes narrowing. They intended to run a server farm in the Blackwood Manor. Yes, Mrs. Higgins, I said. They also attempted to drill through the original 1920 wrought iron gate because they claimed to have lost the key. I heard a collective gasp from the 5 squares on my screen. To these people, drilling a historic gate was a crime worse than assault. Are the perpetrators present on the call to defend these actions? A board member asked. No, I said. They believe they have a right to the property via a lease I contend is forged. However, even if the lease were valid, the zoning laws supersede any private rental agreement. I had sent the meeting link to Graham's email address an hour ago. He hadn't joined. He likely saw it and dismissed it as some boring administrative nonsense, assuming that because he was a wealthy white man in a suit, he didn't need to answer to a local committee. That arrogance was his undoing. Mrs. Higgins adjusted her glasses. Ms. Lopez, the council takes a very dim view of commercial industrialization in the historic district. The heat generation alone could damage the limestone foundation. The noise pollution would violate the neighborhood covenant. The council voted unanimously in 4 minutes. They issued an immediate cease and desist order against Graham and Derek Caldwell. The order prohibited the installation, operation, or storage of any industrial computing equipment on the premises. It also prohibited any unauthorized modification to the electrical grid or the physical structure of the gate. But the kicker was the fine structure. Any violation of this order, Mrs. Higgins read into the record, will result in a penalty of $1,000 per day, per violation, retroactive to the first reported incident. Furthermore, the council authorizes the immediate involvement of local law enforcement to prevent damage to a protected heritage site. It was perfect. It wasn't a family dispute anymore. Now, if Derek plugged in a single server, he wasn't just annoying his sister. He was attacking the town's heritage. Thank you, council, I said, and ended the call. I immediately forwarded the digital order to 3 recipients. First, the local police department dispatch. I added a note. Please attach to the file for 440 Blackwood Lane. Any attempt by the Caldwells to access the property with this equipment is now a violation of municipal zoning law. Second, the Regional Electric Company. Attached is a court-ordered prohibition on transferring service to Derek Caldwell. Any authorization of service transfer will be considered aiding in the violation of a preservation order. Third, to Grant Halloway, we have the leverage. It's official. Now, Derek was trapped. He couldn't move the rigs in without bankrupting himself with fines. He couldn't modify the power. He couldn't even drill a lock without the town coming down on him. I had taken away his tools. The house was quiet, but my phone was not. At 4:30, it rang. It was Marilyn. I stayed at the screen. The name Mom flashed in white letters against a black background. It felt alien. I hadn't called her Mom in my head for years. She was Marilyn. She was a woman who watched me drown and critiqued my swimming stroke. I let it ring. It stopped, then rang again immediately. She was persistent. She probably realized that the public shaming hadn't worked. Or perhaps Derek had just received the email notification about the cease and desist order and was currently screaming at her. I let it go to voicemail. Then a text message appeared. Claire, pick up. We need to talk privately, without the lawyers. Just family. I laughed out loud. It was a harsh, dry sound in the empty library. Just family. That was their favorite trap. Just family meant no witnesses. Just family meant they could guilt, manipulate, and lie without anyone holding them accountable. They wanted me to step out of the legal arena I had built and come back into the emotional mud pit where they were the masters. I didn't reply. Instead, I opened my laptop again. I had one more piece of the puzzle to place before the sun went down. Grant had mentioned a reporter, Andrea Mott. She wrote for the Glen Haven Gazette, a small paper that usually covered bake sales and high school football. But Andrea had a reputation. She had broken a story 2 years ago about a developer trying to bribe the zoning board. She liked to fight. I found her email address. I composed a new message. The subject line was simple, the truth about the Blackwood Manor incident. I attached the folder. I attached the video of the locksmith. I attached the photo of the forged lease. I attached the screenshot of Marilyn's Facebook post calling me mentally unstable. I attached the new cease and desist order from the council. And finally, I attached the screenshot of Derek's loan fraud judgment. I wrote a short body for the email. Ms. Mott, my name is Claire Lopez. You may have seen the social media post by Marilyn Caldwell claiming I have suffered a mental break and abandoned my family in the snow. This is false. The attached documents outline a coordinated attempt by my family to commit identity theft, real estate fraud, and utility sabotage to cover up a defaulted $200,000 loan. They are using the guise of a family reunion to occupy a historic property for commercial mining operations in direct violation of town zoning laws. They are coming back tonight. I thought you might want to see what a real family Christmas looks like. I hit send. I sat back and watched the snow fall outside the window. The sun was setting, casting long purple shadows across the lawn. The house felt different now. It wasn't just a shelter. It was a weapon. I had loaded it with laws, regulations, and evidence. I was not the victim anymore. I was the bait. And they were starving. They would come back. They had to. Derek's deadline was looming, and Graham's ego was bruised. They would come back, and they would find that the locks were the least of their problems. I stood up and walked to the kitchen to pour a glass of wine. As I passed the hallway mirror, I caught my reflection. I looked tired. My hair was pulled back in a messy bun, and I was wearing 3 layers of sweaters, but my eyes were clear. There was no fear in them. Tonight, I whispered to myself. Tonight, we finish it. The reply from Andrea Mott came 17 minutes after I sent the email. It was not the sensational, eager response of a tabloid writer hungry for gossip. It was the cautious, clipped response of a journalist who had been burned before. Miss Lopez, she wrote, I have reviewed your attachments. If these documents are authentic, you have a significant story. But I do not run one-sided domestic disputes. I need to verify the zoning order and the police report. And I need to see you in person. Tonight, 7 p.m. I replied with one word. Agreed. I spent the next 2 hours preparing. I did not prepare hors d'oeuvres or polish the silver. I prepared a dossier. I printed hard copies of the cease and desist order from the Preservation Council. I printed the identity theft report with the federal case number clearly visible in the header. I printed the timeline of the invasion, cross-referenced with the timestamps on the security footage I had backed up to 3 different cloud servers. At 7 o'clock sharp, a rusted Subaru hatchback rolled up the driveway. It parked around the back near the garage, just as I had instructed. Andrea Mott stepped out. She was older than I expected, perhaps in her 50s, wearing a heavy parka and practical boots. She looked at the dark, imposing silhouette of the manor, then at the single light I had left on in the kitchen window. She did not smile when I opened the door. She wiped her boots on the mat and walked straight to the kitchen island where I had laid out the papers. Coffee? I asked. Just the facts, she said, pulling a notepad from her pocket. Why are you telling me this? Why not just let the lawyers handle it? Because lawyers take months, I said, sliding the file toward her, and my family operates in the shadows. They rely on the fact that I'm too embarrassed to make a scene. They rely on the assumption that a daughter will always protect her parents' reputation, no matter how much they hurt her. I am done protecting them. Andrea picked up the cease and desist order. She scanned it, her eyebrows lifting slightly. She picked up the loan fraud evidence I had dug up on Derek. She looked at the photos of the locksmith drilling the gate. "This is aggressive," she murmured. "It is survival," I said. She looked at me then, really looked at me, assessing whether I was the unstable woman Marilyn had painted on Facebook. "Your mother says you're off your medication," Andreas said bluntly. "I have never been on medication," I replied. "I can give you my medical records if you like. The only thing I suffer from is a chronic inability to let people steal my house." Andrea cracked a smile. It was small, but it was real. She tapped the photo of the locksmith. "This guy," she said. "The locksmith. Miller. I know him. He does the locks for the school district. He's a decent guy. If he was part of this, he was tricked." "That's what I'm counting on," I said. As if summoned by the mention of his name, my phone rang. It was a local number I didn't recognize. I put it on speaker so Andrea could hear. "Hello, Miss Lopez." The voice was shaky, rough with stress. "This is Jim Miller, the locksmith from yesterday." I looked at Andrea. She nodded for me to continue. "Mr. Miller," I said, "I'm listening." "Look, I haven't slept all night," Miller said, his voice cracked. "Your dad, Mr. Caldwell, he told me you were suicidal. He told me you were in there with a bottle of pills, and he needed to get in to save your life. He was crying. The mom was crying. I thought I was doing the right thing. Then I saw the post on Facebook," he continued, taking a ragged breath. "And I saw the order from the council today about the mining rigs. You don't bring server racks to save a suicidal girl. I realized I was the tool they used to break into your home." "You were," I said softly. "But you can fix it." "How?" he asked. "I don't want to lose my license. I don't want to go to jail." "You won't," I said, "if you tell the truth. I'm sitting here with Andrea Mott from the Gazette." There was a silence on the line. Then Miller spoke, his voice firmer. "I'll tell her," he said. "I'll tell her everything. I'm not going down for those people." I handed the phone to Andrea. She spent 20 minutes interviewing him, her pen flying across her notepad. When she hung up, the skepticism was gone from her eyes. She wasn't just looking at a family feud anymore. She was looking at a crime. "This changes things," Andreas said, closing her notebook. "You have a witness who admits he was manipulated into facilitating a break-in. You have the zoning violation. You have the paper trail. I have one more thing," I said. I told her about the phone call I had received an hour before she arrived. It had been from Arthur Abernathy, the president of the Glen Haven Historical Society. He was a man who cared more about 19th century limestone than he did about human feelings. And right now, he was incandescent with rage. He had seen the damage to the gate. He had heard about the industrial equipment. To him, the Caldwells were not just squatters. They were vandals. He had offered to organize a perimeter watch of the property. "I don't need a perimeter watch, Arthur," I had told him. "I need guests." "Guests?" Andrea asked, looking at me with confusion. "Tomorrow is Christmas Eve," I said. "My family is coming back. They are desperate. Derek needs those machines running before January 1st. They will try to get in again, and this time they won't bring a locksmith. They will break a window or kick down a door because they think the house is empty and weak." "So," Andrea asked. "So I'm hosting a party," I said. "The Heritage Holiday Open House. It's a legitimate event under the Trust's charter. I'm inviting the Historical Society. I'm inviting the Preservation Council. I'm inviting you." Andrea stayed at me, and then she laughed. A loud, genuine laugh. "You're going to fill the house with the very people who can arrest them," she said. "Exactly," I said. "But here's the trick. The front of the house must remain dark. No exterior lights, no wreaths on the door. To anyone watching from the street, it must look like I've given up and fled. I want them to think the fortress is abandoned." "It's a trap," Andrea said. "It's a surprise party," I corrected. By the next morning, the 24th of December, the plan was in motion. It was a strange feeling. Usually, on Christmas Eve, I was invisible. I was a ghost in my parents' house, avoiding eye contact, waiting for the night to end. Today, I was a general. I spent the morning cleaning the main hall, not for my mother's approval, but for my allies. I set up a long table in the dining room, but instead of a turkey, I laid out documents, copies of the deed, copies of the preservation orders. It was an exhibit of my ownership. At 2 o'clock in the afternoon, Arthur Abernathy arrived with 3 members of the Historical Society. They brought wine and cheese, but their eyes were sharp. They walked around the property, inspecting the gate, tutting at the drill marks, shaking their heads at the tire tracks on the lawn. They were not there to celebrate the holidays. They were there to defend the district. They were my infantry. At 4 o'clock, the private security arrived. I had hired him through a contact of Grant's. His name was Officer Tate. He was off duty, meaning he was in plain clothes, but he carried his badge and his service weapon on his belt. He was not there as a favor. He was there as a paid contractor, instructed to enforce the trespassing laws to the letter. I want you in the library, I told him. If they breach the door, you do not engage immediately. Wait until they are inside. Wait until they have committed the act of breaking and entering. Tate nodded. He was a man of few words, which I appreciated. You want them to hang themselves, he said. Metaphorically, I said. By 6 o'clock, the house was full. There were 12 of us in total. Andrea Mott sat in the kitchen, her laptop open, ready to record. Arthur Abernathy and his cohorts were in the parlor admiring the original crown molding and drinking the expensive wine I had bought. Jim Miller, the locksmith, had even shown up, looking sheepish and holding a fruitcake as a peace offering. He sat by the back door, ready to identify Graham the moment he walked in. But the house was silent. I had given strict orders. No music, no loud laughter. We kept the heavy velvet drapes drawn tight. From the outside, Blackwood Manor was a black hole. The windows were dark. The porch light was off. The snow on the front steps was undisturbed. To any observer, it looked like the heat was still off. It looked like the crazy daughter had retreated to a hotel or a hospital, leaving the prize unguarded. I stood in the foyer, in the shadows of the grand staircase. I was wearing a black dress, simple and severe. I wasn't wearing it for them. I was wearing it for me. They believed the world owed them understanding. They believed that because they shared my DNA, they owned my property. That arrogance made them sloppy. At 10:28, the motion sensor on the outer perimeter triggered. A small red light blinked on my screen. I leaned in on camera 2, which covered the bend in the driveway. A shape detached itself from the darkness. It was a vehicle, a large, dark SUV. It was moving at a crawl, barely 5 miles an hour, and its headlights were off. I felt a surge of adrenaline, cold and electric. They were sneaking in. They were not coming as guests. They were not coming as family members dropping by for a holiday visit. They were coming like thieves, prowling in the dark to avoid detection. I picked up my phone and typed a single message to the group chat I had set up with the people in the other rooms. Target in sight. Silence. The murmuring in the parlor stopped instantly. The scratching of Andrea's typing ceased. The house plunged into a heavy, expectant silence. I watched the screen. The SUV rolled past the open gate. It did not stop. It continued up the long winding drive, the tires crushing the snow with a soft crunching sound that the microphones picked up clearly. Then a second vehicle appeared behind it, the rental truck. They had brought the cavalry. The SUV came to a halt in the circular turnaround in front of the main steps. The engine cut out, but the doors did not open immediately. They were sitting there, watching the house. I could imagine the conversation inside the car. Graham would be telling everyone to stay calm. Marilyn would be checking her makeup in the visor mirror, preparing her face for the performance of the distraught mother. Derek would be checking his phone, anxious about the time, anxious about his loan sharks. I walked to the front window of the library. I stood behind the heavy velvet curtain, leaving a sliver of space just wide enough for one eye. I saw the dark shape of the SUV sitting in the snow. It looked like a heist. My phone buzzed in my hand. I looked down. It was a text message from a number I did not have saved, but I knew who it was. It was Marilyn. Open the door. Claire. It's Christmas. Don't make us do this the hard way. I stared at the words, "Don't make us do this," as if I were forcing them to break into my home, as if my refusal to be a victim was an act of aggression. It was the classic language of the abuser. "Look what you made me do." I did not reply. I did not delete the message. I took a screenshot and sent it to the folder named Evidence. I looked back out the window. The driver's side door of the SUV opened. Graham stepped out. He was wearing a black wool coat and leather gloves. He looked up at the dark windows of the Manor. He looked angry. He waved his hand at the truck behind him. The truck door opened, and Derek jumped out. He was holding something in his hand. It was long and metallic. A crowbar. My breath caught in my throat. They were not going to knock. They had tried the locksmith, and that had failed. They had tried the police, and that had failed. Now, under the cover of a dark Christmas Eve, they were resorting to brute force. I signaled to Officer Tate in the hallway. He nodded and moved deeper into the shadows, his hand resting near his hip. Graham and Derek walked up the stone steps to the front porch. I could hear their boots heavy on the wood. I moved away from the window and stood in the center of the library. I could see the front door through the open archway. I waited. There was no doorbell. There was no knock. There was a scratching sound. Metal testing wood. Then a thud. Then another thud. Harder this time. They were testing the frame. They were looking for the weak point. I heard Graham's voice, muffled but audible through the thick oak. "Just pop the side pane," he said. "The one near the handle." I watched the door handle jiggle violently. The deadbolt held firm. The secondary latch held firm. I had reinforced this house to withstand a siege, and it was doing its job. But they were determined. I heard the distinct, high-pitched scrape of a tool being wedged into the door jamb. It was a sound that set my teeth on edge. It was the sound of violation. Inside the parlor, I heard a gasp from Mrs. Higgins. She had heard it, too. The reality of what was happening was sinking in for my guests. This wasn't a theoretical dispute. This was a physical attack on a home. I looked at the phone in my hand. It was 10:32 p.m. Every second they spent on that porch was a second they were digging their own graves. Every scratch on the door was a felony. Every minute they spent trying to break in while I stood silently inside was proof that they were not here to love me. I closed my eyes for a brief moment, grounding myself. I thought of the 7-year-old girl sitting on the stairs, waiting to be remembered. I told her to be quiet. I told her that tonight, she didn't have to wait anymore. Tonight, the people who forgot her were going to find out exactly who she had become. The scratching stopped. There was a moment of silence. Then, a loud, ringing crack echoed through the foyer. It was the sound of metal striking metal. Derek had swung the crowbar. He wasn't attacking the wood anymore. He was attacking the lock itself. "It begins," I whispered. The metallic crack of the crowbar against the lock was the starting gun. I watched the security feed on my phone with a strange, detached fascination. It was happening exactly as I had predicted. Yet, seeing it, actually watching my father and brother assault my front door like common criminals, felt surreal. But they weren't just relying on brute force this time. They had brought backup. Through the window, I saw a fourth figure standing nervously behind Graham. It was another man in workwear, holding a drill case. He wasn't Miller. He was younger, shiftier, looking around at the dark trees with obvious apprehension. Graham had evidently found a locksmith who asked fewer questions. Or perhaps he was paying this one double to ignore the screaming red flags. Graham turned to the new locksmith, shouting over the wind, "Drill it." The key broke off in the lock. "We have the deed right here." He waved a sheaf of papers in the air. It wasn't the forged lease this time. I zoomed in on the camera feed. It looked like a power of attorney form. They had escalated. They weren't just claiming tenancy anymore. They were claiming I was incompetent. They were trying to seize control of me, not just the house. The new locksmith hesitated. "This doesn't look right, buddy. The lights are all out. Just do your job." Graham roared, his facade of the polite gentleman completely gone. "My daughter is inside and she is not responding. She is a danger to herself. We have medical power of attorney." Marilyn, standing on the bottom step, picked up her cue instantly. She looked up at the dark house and wailed, "Claire, honey, open the door. Mommy is here. We just want to help you." It was a performance worthy of Broadway. She was clutching her chest, her face contorted in practiced agony. But I knew better. I zoomed in on her face. Her eyes were dry. They were scanning the windows, looking for movement, calculating the odds of success. And then there was Derek. He wasn't helping with the door. He was standing back near the porch railing, holding his phone up. The screen was glowing bright in the darkness. He was live streaming. "Hey, guys," Derek was saying to his invisible audience, likely the few creditors and crypto bros still following him. I looked at the Christmas tree I had set up in the corner of the Great Hall. It was a live spruce, 12 feet tall, smelling of winter and sap. I hadn't put any of the family ornaments on it. No macaroni stars made by Derek in kindergarten. No fragile glass baubles handed down from Marilyn's grandmother. I had decorated it with white lights and simple crystal icicles. It was cold, elegant, and strong. For 35 years, Christmas had been a performance of a happy family that didn't exist. It had been a minefield where I had to tiptoe around their egos, their neglect, their sudden, biting criticisms. I touched a branch of the tree. The needles were sharp against my fingertips. This year, I wasn't tiptoeing. I had built a wall. I had built it out of strangers who cared more about the law than my parents cared about me. I had built it out of paper and ink and zoning codes. Grant Holloway texted me at 6:30. "I'm on standby. Phone is on loud. Good luck, Claire." I put the phone in my pocket. I looked around the room at my strange, motley collection of guests. A reporter, a guilt-ridden locksmith, a group of elderly preservationists, a hired gun. They were not my family. But tonight, they were my people. They were the witnesses to my reality. At 7 o'clock, the motion sensor on the front gate pinged my phone. The house went deathly still. In the parlor, Arthur Abernathy put down his wine glass. In the kitchen, Andrea Mott hit the record button on her voice memo app. Officer Tate stepped out of the library and stood in the shadows of the hallway alcove. I walked to the window and peered through the crack in the curtain. A car was moving slowly down the street. It didn't have its headlights on. It was prowling. It was a rental truck this time, a large, boxy moving truck. They weren't just bringing the service. They were bringing furniture. They were planning to move in fully. The truck paused at the gate. I saw a figure jump out. It was Derek. He didn't bother with a keypad this time. He had a pair of bolt cutters. I watched as he snapped the chain I had draped across the gate earlier that day. It was a dummy chain, meant to look pathetic and easily defeated. He cut it. The gate swung open. The truck rolled through. I turned back to the room. My heart was pounding, but it wasn't the erratic rhythm of panic. It was the heavy, powerful beat of a gavel coming down. "Get ready," I whispered to the darkness. The truck rumbled up the drive. The engine cut. I heard car doors slam. I heard muffled voices. "Just break the window near the latch," I heard Derek say. "It's cheaper to replace glass than a lock. Do it quick." Graham's voice hissed. "It's freezing." I stood in the center of the foyer, my hands clasped in front of me. I waited for the sound of shattering glass. I looked at the tree one last time. The white lights twinkled in the gloom. "Merry Christmas, Mom and Dad," I thought. "Welcome to the open house." The house was breathing. That was the only way I could describe it. For decades, Blackwood Manor had stood empty, a hollow shell of limestone and oak. But tonight, it felt alive. It was holding its breath, just as I was, waiting for the infection to return so it could finally be purged. I stood in the library, which I had converted into a temporary command center. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn tight, blocking any spill of light onto the snowy lawn outside. On the desk, my laptop screen was split into a grid of 6 distinct feeds. The night vision cameras that Dave, the electrician, had installed so discreetly were working perfectly. They painted the world outside in shades of ghostly green and sharp, high-contrast black. I could see the individual snowflakes drifting down onto the driveway. I could see the tire tracks from the rental truck that Derek had driven earlier, now filled with fresh powder. I could see the iron gate, currently standing open where he had cut the chain, looking like a broken jaw. Inside, the atmosphere was a surreal blend of a cocktail party and a stakeout. The air smelled of expensive Merlot, beeswax candles, and the faint, nervous perspiration of my guests. I had asked everyone to keep their voices down, and they had complied with a solemnity that bordered on religious. In the parlor, Arthur Abernathy sat in a high-backed wing chair, swirling a glass of red wine. He was looking at the original crown molding with a critical eye, occasionally whispering to Mrs. Higgins about the tragic state of the plasterwork. They were not just neighbors. They were the jury. They represented the history of Glen Haven, the very thing my family was coming to defile. They were insulted personally by the presence of industrial servers in a preservation district, and their indignation was a palpable force in the room. Jim Miller, the locksmith, sat on an ottoman near the fireplace. He looked miserable. He had not touched the wine I offered him. He kept wringing his hands, looking at the door, then at me, then back at the door. He was the penitent sinner, here to confess. I needed him to be uncomfortable. His guilt was the fuel that would bane down Graham's narrative of the concerned father. And then there was Andrea Mott. She had positioned herself in the corner of the dining room where the shadows were deepest. She had a clear line of sight to the foyer but remained almost invisible to anyone entering from the front door. Her laptop was open, the screen dimmed to the lowest setting. She was typing notes, her face illuminated only by the faint blue glow. She had told me she would remain neutral, that she was here to observe, not to intervene. That was exactly what I wanted. I did not need a savior. I needed a scribe. I walked into the foyer, my heels making no sound on the Persian rug I had rolled out to dampen the acoustics. Officer Tate was there, standing in the alcove beneath the stays. He was leaning against the wall, arms crossed, his eyes closed. He looked like he was sleeping, but I knew he wasn't. He was a coiled spring. "Everything good," he whispered without opening his eyes. "We are ready," I said. I checked the time on my watch. It was 10:15 in the evening. Outside, the wind was picking up, rattling the window panes in their frames. It was a perfect Christmas Eve storm, the kind that usually drives people to huddle around fires with their loved ones. But my loved ones were not huddling. They were hunting. I walked to the small table I had set up near the front door. On it lay a single sheet of paper. It was heavy, cream-colored cardstock. The header read, "Notice of no trespass," printed in bold black letters. Beneath it, in legal language drafted by Grant Halloway, was a declaration that Graham, Marilyn, and Derek Caldwell were permanently barred from the premises of 440 Blackwood Lane, and that any entry would be considered a criminal act under State Penal Code Section 198. I ran my finger over the paper. It was sharp. It was a shield and a sword combined. I went back to the library and looked at the monitors again. Nothing. Just the snow and the wind. The waiting was the hardest part. In my job at Hyen, I often had to wait for days after flagging a compliance violation before the regulator swept in. I knew the rhythm of the calm before the crash. But this was different. This was personal. My stomach was a knot of cold tension. But my hands were steady. I had rehearsed this scenario in my head 1,000 times since yesterday. I knew every line I would say. I knew every move they would make. They were predictable because they were entitled. "We're here at the family estate. My sister has gone totally rogue. She locked us out on Christmas Eve. But we're not giving up. We're taking back what belongs to the family. Just us Caldwells, right?" He panned the camera to Graham, yelling at the locksmith. Then to Marilyn, crying. He was building a narrative. He was documenting his own crime and calling it heroism. I signaled to Andrea Mott in the kitchen. She nodded, her pen hovering over her notebook. She was writing down every word. In the parlor, Arthur Abernathy and the Historical Society members were frozen. They were watching the live feed I had cast to the television screen above the fireplace. Their faces were a mixture of horror and disgust. To them, this wasn't just a break-in. It was a desecration of the neighborhood's peace. Outside, the locksmith finally caved. Graham's bullying was effective. The man stepped up to the door and pressed his drill against the deadbolt. The sound of drilling filled the house again, louder this time, vibrating through the wood. But Derek was impatient. He put his phone in his pocket and grabbed the crowbar again. "Forget the drill," Derek shouted. He jammed the flat end of the crowbar into the gap between the double doors. He leaned his entire body weight into it. "No," the locksmith yelled, stepping back. "You're going to break the frame." "I don't care," Derek screamed. Inside the foyer, I stood perfectly still. Officer Tate had unholstered his taser. He was watching the door with the intense focus of a predator. "Wait," I whispered. "Let them breach." There was a sickening crunch of wood splintering. The heavy oak, which had stood for 100 years, groaned under the pressure. The deadbolt was strong, but the wood around it was yielding. Derek gave a final, primal grunt and shoved. Bang! The sound was like a gunshot. The door flew open, rebounding off the interior wall with a violence that shook the floorboards. A gust of freezing wind and snow blasted into the warm foyer, extinguishing the candles on the entry table instantly. Derek stumbled into the house, the crowbar still in his hand, his chest heaving. He looked wild, his eyes manic. "We're in," he shouted, turning back to the porch. "Dad, we're in." Graham marched in behind him, shaking snow off his coat. His face flushed with victory. Marilyn followed, stepping gingerly over the splintered wood, still dabbing at her dry eyes. The new locksmith lingered on the porch, looking terrified, clearly realizing he had just participated in a felony. Derek raised his crowbar in triumph. He looked around the dark foyer, his eyes adjusting to the gloom. "Claire," he screamed, "game over. Come out and sign the papers. We're not leaving until—" And then he stopped. He stopped because his eyes had finally adjusted to the dim light. He stopped because he saw the Christmas tree lit with hundreds of silent white lights. He stopped because he realized the foyer was not empty. From the shadows of the parlor, Arthur Abernathy stepped out. He was holding his glass of wine, looking at Derek with the disdain one might reserve for a cockroach on a wedding cake. Behind him, 3 other elderly members of the Historical Society stood in a phalanx of judgment. From the kitchen, Andrea Mott emerged. She held her phone up, recording. Her face was grim. From the corner near the coat rack, Jim Miller, the original locksmith, stood up. He looked at Graham with a mixture of shame and anger. And from the alcove under the stays, Officer Tate stepped into the light. His hand was resting on his belt. His badge gleamed in the light of the Christmas tree. The silence that fell over the room was heavier than the door itself. Derek lowered the crowbar slowly, his mouth hanging open. He looked from the police officer to the reporter to the neighbors. He looked like a child who had been caught setting fire to the curtains. Graham froze mid-step. His arrogant bluster evaporated instantly. He looked at the crowd, then at the shattered door frame, then back at the crowd. His brain was frantically trying to recalibrate, to find a spin, a lie that could cover this. Marilyn let out a small, sharp gasp. Her hand flew to her throat. The tears stopped instantly. "Oh," Graham said. His voice was weak, stripped of all its power. "We didn't know you had company." He tried to smile. It was a ghastly, nervous grin. "We were just worried," Graham stammered, looking at Officer Tate. "It was a wellness check, a family emergency. We thought she was hurt." Marilyn latched onto the lie immediately. Yes, she sobbed, trying to summon the tears again. "We thought she was unconscious. We had to break in to save her." I stepped out from behind the heavy velvet curtain of the library archway. I walked into the center of the foyer. The draft from the open door was freezing, biting at my bare arms, but I didn't feel it. I felt only the heat of the moment I had been waiting for my entire life. I stood between them and my guests. I looked at Derek, still holding the weapon he had used to smash my home. I looked at Graham, clutching the fraudulent power of attorney papers. I looked at Marilyn, whose mask was slipping to reveal the terrified narcissist beneath. "You didn't come to save me," I said. My voice was quiet, but in the silence of the hall, it carried like a bell. I held up my phone. On the screen was the footage of Derek streaming his victory speech about taking back what is ours. "You came to rob me," I said. Graham's face went pale. "Claire, please. This is a misunderstanding. Let's go to the kitchen and talk. Just family." "Just family," I repeated. I turned to Grant Holloway, who had walked in from the back office where he had been waiting on speakerphone. He was holding a thick file folder. I looked at Graham. "No more talking," I said. I nodded to Grant. "It's time to read the file." Grant Holloway stepped forward into the pool of light cast by the chandelier. He held the file folder like a weapon, his face set in a mask of absolute, unyielding professional boredom. He did not look at Graham with anger. He looked at him with the fatigue of a man who had to explain gravity to a toddler. "Mr. Caldwell," Grant said, his voice echoing slightly in the high-ceilinged foyer. "You are holding a power of attorney document for Claire Lopez. Is that correct?" Graham straightened his coat, trying to regain the shred of dignity he had lost when he realized he was surrounded. "Yes," he snapped. "It grants us full authority over her financial and medical decisions in the event of incapacitation." He gestured vaguely at the room full of strangers. "And looking at this, she is clearly incapacitated." Grant opened his folder. He pulled out a single sheet of paper with a gold seal at the bottom. "That is fascinating," Grant said. "However, there is a fundamental flaw in your strategy. This property, the Manor at 440 Blackwood Lane, does not belong to Claire Lopez." Graham blinked. "What?" Grant held up the document. "As of 3 weeks ago, this property was transferred in its entirety to the Glen Haven Preservation Trust, a corporate entity registered in the state of Delaware. Miss Lopez is the resident trustee." "Yes, but she does not hold the title." Grant took a step closer to Graham. "Your power of attorney allows you to manage Claire's personal assets," Grant continued. "But it does not give you the authority to break down the door of a corporation. You are not breaking into your daughter's house, Graham. You are breaking into a corporate headquarters, and unless you have a board resolution from the trust authorizing this entry, you are committing corporate espionage and felony trespass." Graham's mouth opened and closed, but no sound came out. The legal ground had just vanished beneath his feet. He looked at the paper in his hand, the paper he had pinned all his hopes on, and realized it was worthless. I stepped forward then. I walked past Grant and stood directly in front of my father. I held up the cream-colored cardstock I had prepared. I cleared my throat. "Graham Caldwell, Marilyn Caldwell, and Derek Caldwell," I read aloud, my voice steady and cold. "You are hereby notified that you are permanently banned from the premises of 440 Blackwood Lane. This notice serves as a formal warning. Any further attempt to enter this property or any refusal to leave immediately constitutes criminal trespass under Penal Code Section 602. I handed the paper to Graham. He didn't take it. It fluttered to the floor, landing on the snow-dusted rug near his expensive Italian shoes. "But we are family," Marilyn cried out, her voice shrill. "You cannot trespass family." I looked at her. I looked at the woman who had spent 30 years prioritizing her image over my existence. "I just did," I said. From the corner of the room, Jim Miller stood up, the original locksmith. He wiped his hands on his jeans and looked at Officer Tate. "Officer," Miller said, his voice heavy with regret but firm with resolve. "I want to go on record. Yesterday, these people hired me to drill the gate. They told me explicitly that the resident was suicidal and unconscious. That was a lie. They used a fabricated emergency to trick me into bypassing a security system." Officer Tate nodded. He looked at Graham. "So, we have a pattern. Attempted entry by fraud yesterday. Forcible entry by destruction of property today." Tate turned his gaze to Derek. My brother was still holding the crowbar. He had lowered it, but he hadn't dropped it. He looked like a trapped animal, his eyes darting from the police officer to the open door. "And you," Officer Tate said, walking slowly toward Derek. "You broke the door frame. That is felony vandalism. You entered with a weapon. That is burglary. And judging by that phone in your pocket," Tate pointed to the rectangle of light glowing in Derek's jacket, "you were broadcasting the whole thing." Derek's hand flew to his pocket. He pulled out the phone. The screen was still active. The comments were scrolling by in a blur. "OMG. Is that the cops? Dude, you are busted. Delete the stream." Derek fumbled with the phone, trying to end the broadcast, trying to erase the evidence of his own stupidity. "Do not touch that." Tate barked. Derek froze. Officer Tate reached out and took the crowbar from Derek's hand. It clattered to the floor with a heavy, final sound. "Turn around," Tate said. "Put your hands behind your back." "No," Derek shouted, stepping back. "I didn't steal anything. I just came to check the servers." "What servers?" Tate asked. "The ones you were ordered by the Preservation Council to remove yesterday." Derek looked at me. His eyes were wide with panic. "Claire, tell him. Tell him." It's a misunderstanding. I'm your brother. I looked at him. I remembered the years of him stealing money from my purse and my parents blaming me for being careless. I remembered him crashing my car and my parents telling me I shouldn't have left the keys out. I remembered him erasing me from the family photos to make space for his trophies. I do not know you, I said. I know a man named Derek who tried to steal my electricity and identity, but I do not have a brother. The handcuffs clicked. The sound was sharp and mechanical. It cut through the tension in the room like a knife. Graham lunged forward. You cannot arrest him. He is a minor. No, he is young. He made a mistake. Officer Tate looked at Graham. He is 28 years old, sir, and you are under arrest, too. Me. Graham sputtered. I didn't break the door. I stood right here. You directed him, Tate said. You hired the locksmith. You provided the fraudulent documents. That makes you a co-conspirator. Conspiracy to commit burglary is a felony. Tate pulled a second pair of cuffs from his belt. Turn around, he ordered Graham. Graham looked at the new locksmith, the one he had hired tonight. That man was already edging toward the door, trying to slip away into the night. Stay right there. Tate yelled at the man without looking. You are an accessory. Sit on the bench. The man sat today. Graham Caldwell, a man who had spent his life believing that consequences were things that happened to poor people, was slowly turned around. His cashmere coat was bunched up as his wrists were locked together. He looked at me over his shoulder. The hate in his eyes was gone, replaced by a terrified confusion. He genuinely could not understand how the world had flipped so completely. Marilyn was the only one left standing free. She stood in the center of the ruin of her family, her hands trembling. She looked at Derek in cuffs. She looked at Graham in cuffs. She looked at the reporters and the neighbors. She realized there was no one left to hide behind. She turned to me. Her face crumpled. It wasn't the fake, theatrical crying of earlier. It was the desperate, ugly sobbing of a woman who was losing her audience. Claire, she wept. How can you do this? Look at what you have done. You have destroyed this family. I didn't answer. I didn't have to. From the shadows of the dining room, Andrea Mott stepped forward. She held up her phone. Actually, Mrs. Caldwell, Andrea said, her voice cutting through Marilyn's sobs, you destroyed it yourself about 3 days ago. Marilyn looked at the reporter. Who are you? I'm the woman you emailed, Andrea said. You sent a tip to the Glen Haven Gazette on December 20th. You claimed that the new owner of the Blackwood Manor was a dangerously unstable woman and that the community should support the family's efforts to intervene. Andrea scrolled on her phone and turned the screen so Marilyn could see it. You were setting up the narrative before you even arrived, Andrea said. You were planning to have Claire committed or discredited so you could take control of the property without questions. That is not a wellness check, Mrs. Caldwell. That is a premeditated conspiracy to defraud. Marilyn's face went white. She looked like a ghost. She had thought she was being clever, planting seeds of doubt in the press. She hadn't realized that in a small town, the press talks to the people. I was just worried, she stammered. And then I played the final card. I took my phone out of my pocket. I opened the audio file I had recorded yesterday. During the chaos at the gate, the one moment Graham had thought I wasn't listening. I pressed play. Graham's voice filled the silent foyer, tiny but unmistakable. We need the address, Marilyn. If Derek does not show the investors a facility by the 1st, they are going to break his legs. We just need to get in, set up the rigs, and take the photos. Once we are in, Claire cannot kick us out. We will own the place. The recording ended. The silence that followed was absolute. Derek looked at Graham. You told Mom about the loan sharks. Graham looked at the floor. Marilyn looked at Graham. You said it was just a cash flow problem. You said we were doing this for his future. I looked at them. The triangulation was complete. They were turning on each other. The unit was fractured. Officer Tate spoke into his radio. Dispatch. I need 2 transport units to 440 Blackwood. I have 3 subjects in custody. Burglary, conspiracy, possession of burglary tools. 3. Marilyn asked, her voice a whisper. Tate looked at her. You sent the emails. You are part of the fraud. He didn't handcuff her yet. He likely ran out of cuffs, but he gestured for her to sit on the bench next to the terrified locksmith. The flashing lights of the backup cruisers washed over the walls of the foyer, painting us all in blue and red. The officers arrived. They took Derek first. He was crying now, ugly, heaving sobs, begging me to call the governor, begging me to tell them it was a prank. I watched him go without a flicker of emotion. Then they took Graham. He tried to walk with dignity, but it's hard to look dignified when you're being guided by the elbow by a deputy half your age. He didn't look at me. He looked at the floor. Finally, a female officer approached Marilyn. Marilyn stood up. She looked at me one last time. Her eyes were red. Her makeup smeared. She looked old. "Claire," she whispered. "Please, it's Christmas." I looked at her. I looked at the woman who had forgotten me for 7 years in a row. I looked at the woman who had sat at a warm table while I sat in a cold car. I took a step closer to her. "Christmas is a day for remembering, Marilyn," I said softly. I paused, letting the words hang in the cold air. "But you only remember me when you need me, and I do not need you anymore." I turned my back on her. I heard the officer say, "Let's go." I heard the door close behind them. I stood there for a long time, facing the Christmas tree. I heard the engines of the police cars start up. I heard the crunch of tires on snow as they drove away, taking the toxicity out of my life, mile by mile. The house was quiet again, but it wasn't empty. Arthur Abernathy cleared his throat. "Well," he said, his voice surprisingly gentle, "that was certainly a historic evening." I turned around. My guests were looking at me, not with pity, but with respect. Andrea Mott closed her notebook. "You know," she said, "I think that's enough news for one night." Off the record, that was incredible. Grant was pouring a fresh glass of wine. He held it out to me. "To the landlord," he said. I took the glass. My hand was steady. I looked at the shattered door frame. It would cost thousands to fix. The foyer was full of snow. The rug was ruined. But as I looked around the room at the warm faces of the strangers who had stood by me, I felt a warmth bloom in my chest that I had never felt in my parents' house. I walked over to the stereo system I had set up in the corner. I pressed a button. Soft jazz filled the room. The sound of a saxophone curled around the pillars, chasing away the memory of the shouting and the drilling. I walked to the front door. The wind was still howling outside, but the police lights were gone. The driveway was empty. The gate was broken, but the threat was gone. I pushed the heavy oak door shut. It wouldn't lock, but Officer Tate had promised to sit in his car at the end of the driveway for the rest of the night. I turned the deadbolt as far as it would go, a symbolic gesture. Then I turned back to the room. The lights of the Christmas tree reflected in the window glass, multiplying into infinity. It was beautiful. It was mine. I raised my glass to the room. "Merry Christmas," I said. And for the first time in 35 years, I knew that I would be remembered, not as a victim, not as an afterthought, but as the woman who bought a manor, fought a war, and won her own peace. I took a sip of the wine. It tasted like victory. If you've made it this far, thank you so much for listening. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What would you have done in my place? Have you ever had to fight to reclaim your peace from toxic people? Tell me what you think in the comments below. I really want to know.